Hi everyone, today we're going to be talking about the female reproductive system. As we all know, DNA is what humans are composed of. From the lesson, we learned that DNA is the genetic material that is passed to cells through division or fertilization. We also know that the structure of DNA is set up to be tightly wrapped around proteins, which are also called histones, so that they can be packaged in distinct chromosomes, like we can see here in the image on the right. Typically, human cells only have 23 pairs of chromosomes. There are 22 autosomal chromosomes and one sex chromosome, which is specified by the X or Y chromosome. Of these 23 pairs, in total, that means there's 46 chromosomes in each human. At the bottom, we see the words haploid and diploid. These words are used to distinguish the number of copies of genetic material a cell contains. In the bottom right corner of the image, you can see the X and Y chromosomes. The X chromosome is the female. Now that we've learned that there are 23 pairs of chromosomes, you may be wondering, why are there pairs? One pair of chromosome originates from the egg, and the other pair originates from the sperm. So once these two pairs combine, that in total creates 46 chromosomes. Here we're going to be talking about gametogenesis. Gametogenesis means the production of new gametes. Gametes are produced when a germ cell undergoes meiosis to produce haploid cells. While gametes are being produced, stem cells are being divided into two non-identical cells, which is also done by meiosis. Once these stem cells are divided, they're typically stored in the testes or the ovaries. In this case, we're going to be talking about the ovaries, which are also known as primary sex organs. Next, we're going to be talking about homologous structures, secondary sex organs, and secondary sex characteristics. As we can infer, male and female reproductive structures differ from one another. One example of the differences would be that the testes are for the male and the ovaries are for the female. Moving along to secondary sex organs, these are described as the structures that support the sperm and the egg. Some of the secondary sex organs that are in a female include the uterine tube, the uterus, the vagina, cervix, and the vulva. On the other hand, secondary sex characteristics are the changes that occur during puberty due to a surge of hormone signals within the body. Some of these characteristics include abnormal hair growth, enlargement of breast tissue, an increase in muscle mass, and broadening of the hips or shoulders. Now that we have a general idea of the homologous structures within the female reproductive system, we're going to be diving in a little bit deeper into the structures. If you didn't know, there are actually two subdivisions of the pelvic cavity, which are the true pelvis and the false pelvis. The true pelvis refers to the most inferior portion of the pelvic cavity, and it also is responsible for homing the internal reproductive organs. Now, the false pelvic cavity is the superior portion of the pelvic cavity, which also supports the small intestines. If you take a look at the image on the right, you can see two different views of the human reproductive system. This picture is also going to be very helpful to refer back to whenever we start talking about other parts of the reproductive system. Moving along, now we will be talking about mesenteries and ligaments. There are actually a couple different types of ligaments that are located within the reproductive system. We have the ovarian ligament, the suspensory ligament, round ligaments, and broad ligaments. The ovarian ligament, which you can see right above the uterus in the image on the right, is responsible for anchoring the ovaries in place. The next ligament we have is the suspensory ligament. This is responsible for anchoring each ovary to the pelvis. It also contains the ovarian nerve plexus, lymphatic vessels, an artery, a vein, as well as it supplies blood to each of the ovaries. On the other hand, Round ligaments are anchors that attach to the uterus to the anterior abdominal wall. If you take another look at the image, the space in between the uterus and the ovary is called the broad ligament. This ligament is responsible for holding the uterus, uterine tubes, and ovaries in the right place by a mesentery. Within this ligament, there are 3 divided distinct parts. The first being the mesometrium, the second being the mesosalpinx, and the third being the mesovarium. The mesometrium's role is to extend over the uterus, and it's located inferior to the ovarian ligament. The mesosalpinx is the portion of the ligament that is folded over top of the uterine tube. And lastly, the mesovarium allows the ovaries to be able to be suspended anteriorly. Here we have the internal reproductive organs. The ovaries are the site for oogenesis, which is the process that stimulates the production and release of a mature oocyte every month. While oogenesis is going on, the ovaries are also responsible for releasing estrogen and progesterone. The uterine tubes, which are also referred to as the fallopian tubes or the oviducts, they act as the channel for the oocyte from the ovary to the uterus. At each end of the uterine tubes, the isthmus is located there to connect the uterus to the tubes. The infundibulum is a wide distal cavity that contains fimbriae, which are finger-like projections. And finally, the ampulla is where fertilization occurs. If we dive deeper into the internal reproductive organs, we have the uterus. The uterus is a muscular organ that is approximately 2 to 3 inches wide and long. The fundus is the portion of the uterus that is superior to the opening of the uterine tubes. The middle part of the uterus is often referred to as the body of uterus as well. The uterus also has 3 layers. The superficial layer being the perimetrium, which covers the exterior portion of the uterus. The middle layer being the myometrium, which is a thick layer of smooth muscle that controls the uterine contractions. And lastly, the innermost layer is the endometrium, which is also split into 2 layers. The uterus also contains uterine arteries, which are often referred to as spiral arteries as well. These supply oxygen and nutrients to the cells within the stratum functionalis, which thickens the layers. Moving on to the cervix is the inferior portion of the uterus that leads to the vagina. The vagina, on the other hand, is a muscular canal that acts as an entrance to the reproductive tract. The walls of the vagina also have folds, which are called rugae, that allow the vagina to expand. Since we've covered the basis of the internal structures, now we're going to be talking about the external structures. The vulva is the beginning of these external structures. The vulva has 2 skin folds that surround the opening of the vagina. The inner set of the skin folds are called the labia minora, and the outer set is called the labia majora. The area between the labia minora is called the vestibule. Within the vestibule, there are many different accessory glands that are embedded. One of the glands that is located just outside the vagina is called the Bartholin gland. These glands are responsible for producing a mucus-like fluid that acts as a lubricant. Also included in the labia minora, it has a fold of skin called the purpurus, which is formed where the labias meet. Continuing from our last slide, underneath the purpurus is the clitoris. The clitoris has another set of accessory glands near it, which are called the Skene's gland. These secrete mucus to help to keep the vestibular area moist. The area where the labia minora meet, just under the vaginal opening, is called the fourchette. There is also another space between the vagina and the anus that is called the perineum. Lastly, the mons pubis is the fatty tissue that's located over the pubic symphysis of the pubic bones. The menstrual cycle takes place when changes are occurring in the ovaries and the uterus. This cycle is regulated by hormones that come from the hypothalamus, the anterior pituitary gland, and the ovaries. The part of the menstrual cycle that involves the ovaries is called the ovarian cycle, which we'll talk about later. On the other hand, the other part of the menstrual cycle that involves the uterus is called the uterine cycle, which we will also touch on later. As mentioned earlier, the ovaries contain oocytes, which are surrounded by supporting cells. When a singular oocyte is surrounded by supporting cells, it is called a follicle, and during the time of ovulation, the oocyte is expelled out of the ovary. These supporting cells begin as primordial follicles, which then develop into primary follicles. Some primary follicles are able to mature into secondary follicles, but these fall off then and die until there is one mature follicle remaining. Once ovulation has completed, there are still some supporting cells that do not get expelled from the ovary. These are called the corpus luteum, and they begin to break down if the pregnancy does not occur within the ovarian cycle. Now we'll be touching on the ovarian cycle. The ovarian cycle is described as changes that are occurring within the ovaries. This cycle typically lasts 28 days long and is divided into two sections, the follicular phase and the luteal phase. The follicular phase starts on day 1 and typically lasts for 14 days, and then the remaining 14 days of the cycle are spent in the luteal phase. These follicles are stimulated and developed by hormones, but they also release hormones too. The hypothalamus produces gonadotropin-releasing hormone, which then sends a signal to the anterior pituitary gland to release follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormones. Now we have the uterine cycle. This cycle is responsible for describing changes that take place within the uterus. There are 3 sections of the uterine cycle. First is the menses, second is the proliferative phase, and third is the secretory phase. Once these phases are completed, if a zygote implants in the endometrium, a hormone called human chronic gonadotropin will signal the corpus luteum to keep secreting estrogen and progesterone so the pregnancy can be maintained. Here we have the steps of fertilization. First, the sperm meets the corona radiata, the outer layer of the follicular cells that surround the oocyte. Under this layer is a membrane that surrounds the cell plasma's membrane, the zona pellucida. Then, when an autosomal reaction is occurring, hydrolytic enzymes from the sperm break down the zona pellucida membrane. From here, the sperm and the oocyte fuse together to trigger membrane depolarization. Once this happens, the cortical granules fuse with the plasma during the cortical reaction. Then, the sperm nucleus enters the oocyte, where cytoplasm and genetic material are transformed into the 23 chromosomes. Once this has been completed, the pronuclei membranes within those 23 chromosome pairs dissolve and a zygote is formed. And lastly, we have early development. Once fertilization has been completed, the zygote must divide into an embryo, where the cell will then develop and move into the uterus from the uterine tubes. In the image on the right, we can see each of the 6 steps it takes before implantation occurs. Then, roughly 8 through 9 days after fertilization, the embryo can be implanted into the uterus. Thank you all for listening to my presentation on the female reproductive system.